My daughter-in-law shoved me off their yacht. They thought $3 billion would buy them everything. My name, my house, my stock, and whatever dignity remained. What happened next not only ruined their plan, it changed the definition of family in my life forever. If this is the kind of story that grabs you, do me a favor right now. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's listening when people try to erase someone from the world for a ledger. They called it a tragic accident on the dock. The papers used softer words: unfortunate fall, presumed drowning. On camera, my son David folded into the posture of bereavement, and Vanessa, his wife, let grief wash across her face like a practiced tide. Off camera, inside their lawyer's office, and on sealed bank phone lines, they moved like men rebalancing a portfolio that had suddenly tilted in their favor. You should know the scale before I tell you how deep the betrayal went. The assets tied to my late husband's trust were vast: public companies, patents, philanthropic funds. People in our circles always spoke of the number with a kind of nervous hush. To them it wasn't a fortune. It was a machine you could feed with other people's silence. For my son and his wife, it became a convenient objective. For me, it became a trap. My life before the yacht was not glamorous. I kept house linens the way other people kept prayers, neatly folded, ready for the next day. Robert, my husband, had been a brilliant man who built something from his kitchen table and a stubborn idea. He taught me to keep notes, to read the fine print, to ask why. Those habits felt small until they saved me. 2 months before the yacht, I'd had hip surgery. I told myself I'd recover quickly. I lied to myself more gently than most liars do. The surgery made walking and exercise in patience. One step measured, the other earned. David visited, turned on his charm, and Vanessa visited in a different way. Text messages that arrived at odd hours, folded questions that sounded casual until you realized they were probes. "You've been feeling better," read one. "Have you thought more about future plans?" read another. It was the courteous voice of predation. They invited me on the cruise in the language of family. "We'll take care of you," Vanessa said when she called. "A little son will do wonders." I trusted them because what else was there to trust? A son's smile had always been my safe harbor. The invitation came at the right time, after a therapy session when I felt the ache of loneliness, and after a medical appointment where a nurse had accidentally left my chart on the counter for anyone to see. So I accepted, careful not to overreach my recovery, careful to keep my cane close and my wits closer. The yacht was smaller than I expected. It smelled faintly of lemon oil and diesel. Cushions were white, my kind of white, the kind you only insulate if you intend to baby the surface underneath. They'd organized a luncheon on deck. David laughed too loudly at something a mutual acquaintance said. Vanessa studied me the way someone studies a painting, looking for brush strokes she could claim as her own. There were little things that day that felt off. Vanessa filmed with her phone under the table, the camera aimed like a trap. She asked inconsequential questions about my prescriptions, about the location of my signature. She commented, almost as an aside, that the trust document would be a shame if anything happened where the decision fell to the courts. The remark landed like gravel. On the rail moments later, David stood behind me with his hand on my shoulder and said, "Mother, you've been through so much. Don't worry about anything." He said it the way men say lines they've been coached to say. Vanessa was beside him, smiling. I remember thinking how perfectly the three of them posed for the photograph that no doubt Vanessa's phone would already capture. They pushed me. There's a sliver of time between surprise and instinct, a thin pain through which your life rewrites itself. 1 second I was hearing David's voice, the next I was tasting salt. The drift of the ocean hit like a wall that had been waiting in shadow. My cane slipped from my hand. The deck rushed away. For a moment there was the ridiculous sensation of falling through a framed family portrait, the edges of everyone's faces blurring as they watched me go. The cold hit every place I had thought belonged only to the old, my bones, the surgical scar that had been trying to knit itself, the memory of a fall 20 years earlier. My lungs clashed with the ocean as if the sea and my breath were two strangers negotiating terms. I remember thinking, absurdly, that dying here would be such an undignified ending. Wet linen, a damp dress, a clipboard of estate papers fluttering on the deck. I remember thinking, too, that I was not ready to be convenient. I splashed toward the surface like it was a secret I'd been taught to keep. The ocean is heavier than people in city towers imagine. Clothes become ballast, and hands become lead. I've never been a great swimmer, and the hip surgery made every movement painful and deliberate. Panic narrowed my vision. I fought with the clarity of someone who has nothing more to lose than the selfish breaths that still belong to them. A small fishing skiff bobbed half a nautical mile off the marina, Jake Morrison's weathered boat. He was a man with hands that told stories, calluses, fish, gnarled knuckles, the kind of face the sea carves into someone until they resemble their own maps. Jake and his grandson Tyler were out repairing nets. They had a radio tuned to the harbor channel, and for reasons I only understood later, a face that notices the anomalies. The wrong colored flag, a missing mooring, a splash where there should be none. They saw me. I don't know who noticed first, the old man or the child, but Jake throttled his engine and fished me out of a sea that would have been content to take me. Tyler wrapped my shoulders in a thin jacket and pressed a towel to my face like a litany. Jake's boat smelled of tar and fish and the inside of a barn in winter. It smelled of useful things. "You're coming with us," Jake said, and there was no question in it. On his boat, I clung to him like an anchor. He pulled me into the cabin, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and looked at my hip like a mechanic would look at a vintage car. Practical, curious, precise. He told me the obvious things. I was lucky. I was not dead. Tyler, who looked like an exaggerated version of Jake with the same crooked grin, offered me a sandwich with too much mayonnaise. The small kindnesses kept me tethered. While we were clinging to life and the smell of tar, a rumor had already crossed the marina and leapt into the town's bloodstream. Someone saw the yacht drift. Someone else saw my cane left on the deck, and the grapevine, which the local news sometimes pruned for their own advantage, began to whisper that I had fallen from the boat. By the time Jake pulled into the dock, there was a police launch circling. There were uniforms and flashlights and questions meted like currency. I told the truth. I told the names of the people on the deck. The officer's eyes were sympathetic but cautious. The kind of sympathy a person shows when they suspect a family holiday has turned ugly. They took down my statement like a transcript of a play in which I had been cast as the unfortunate widow. The press did what press does. The headline that night called it an accidental death before anyone had certified a death. A reporter from a local affiliate ran pictures of David and Vanessa hugging as they pretended to stare at a closed casket that did not belong to them. The speed of their public grief was mechanized, like a factory that had been primed to produce tears. I did not go home that night. I learned, painfully, that a house is not only a stack of walls, but a ledger of who gets to live within them. My house, which had felt like a museum for a life I had planned entirely on paper and polite conversation with vendors, was already being wrestled toward a different fate. What I did next was not glamorous or lawful on paper. It was necessary. Mrs. Chen's B&B sits on the edge of the town, a place of good linen and better soup. She makes a mean congee and seems to have been born with the gift of shelter. "You look like you've been in the sea for an hour and a half," she said when I walked through her door, wrapped in someone else's sweater and smelling vaguely of fishermen and panic. She did not ask many questions. She brought me a room with cracked sunlight and a kettle, handed me a pad and a pen, and said, "Write it down. Keep writing. Writing is my habit. It organizes chaos." I began a list of names and dates, the same way someone might mark off stitches on a knitting chart. Jake called twice that evening to report that David had been seen on the marina, talking to a lawyer, and that Vanessa had taken pictures outside the house, as if she were cataloging grief. "Let them think you're dead," Jake said on that first night, blunt and practical. He meant if they declared me dead on paper and started moving assets, I could watch them reveal what they were willing to do. The idea seemed insane and brilliant in the same breath. I was not a vigilante. I was someone who had been given a second unwelcome life and intended to use it. The public narrative that followed my disappearance was neat and profitable. An obituary appeared before the autopsy would have. My name was printed in the papers with the past tense where I expected the present. That same ease was used by people in suits who had the right contacts and the wrong intentions. Probate motions were filed. Bank accounts were frozen. Insurance claims were read like love letters. They moved quickly, the way people do when they smell an opportunity that looks like a windfall. At Mrs. Chen's, I read the papers as if they were a foreign language I had once taught myself. The obituary listed my virtues, a list of philanthropic gestures. It spoke in curated softness about loss and left out the calculus that most people use to justify their crimes. I watched footage of David and Vanessa at a memorial, a tucked-in performance of grief. Their faces were wet and their hands were dry. Their eyes waited for cues from the lawyer. Part of me wanted to scream, and part of me was oddly impressed at how perfectly they had choreographed a lie. It was in the silence of the second night, pen paused over paper, that Jake knocked and slid a thin envelope under the door. Inside were photographs, shots taken from a distance, grainy surveillance from the morning after the luncheon, showing a woman in nurse's scrubs entering Whitmore Reproductive Services with a bundle. There was also a picture of a document, just a corner of a hospital form, but enough to show a name, Sarah Collins. Sarah Collins was a name I had seen before. She was a young woman, 20-something, a teen mother according to a few community threads. She had been listed in the Whispers as someone who had signed on to be a surrogate through a private broker. In that black and white photograph she held an infant like a treasure and smiled with the kind of softness that makes a house a home. 2 days later, I went back to my house. I don't have the luxury of saying my entrance was clean or particularly legal. I will tell you the facts as they happened. The house showed the first signs of being claimed. The safe in the study had been cleared, but someone had been too eager. In a drawer beneath Robert's old ledger, I found a slim folder labeled in his careful hand, Margaret Project. It was the kind of name one gives a plan when you think it will be private forever. The folder was a document graveyard. There were photocopies of medical records that did not match the dates I recalled, bank statements with signatures that trembled in places they never had before, and a will that had been notarized with a stamp that looked suspiciously like my own, but with an ink blot where my name should have been. There were email printouts, an exchange between Vanessa and an attorney named Miranda Torres, arranging language, dates, and a list of witnesses. The language was clinical and precise, as if they were drafting a purchase order rather than a document that would tilt the life of an infant and an old woman. In a shallow box beneath those papers lay a birth certificate bearing the name Robert Sarah Harrison. My name was there by implication. My role had been quietly rewritten in official ink. I stared at the certificate until the ink blurred. There were receipts from Whitmore Reproductive Services stapled to the back, payments, consultations, signatures. There was a notation in the file about surrogate death, pending review. The phrase sat like a bruise on the page. I do not intend to paint a picture of gruesome details. The document stated that Sarah Collins had died under suspicious circumstances. It did not explain how or why, only that her death was an anomaly someone had tried to measure. I sat down on the floor, the house tilting in that moment like a ship taking on water. The betrayal was a mosaic. David's handshake at the yacht, Vanessa's small questions, Miranda Torres's clinical emails, invoices that read like receipts for the unthinkable. What had once been a life's careful architecture now revealed cracks that had been exploited. I knew then that this was not a domestic spat. This was an orchestrated plan, threaded through medical services, legal paperwork, and the kind of polite professionals who believe a signature absolves them of curiosity. The folder contained a calendar, dates circled in Vanessa's handwriting, a practice run of timing for signatures, notations about when I would be most vulnerable. There was even a shorthand list that said accelerate probate, next to a line that read create air, minimize outside scrutiny. My hands shook, not from cold but from recognition. The people I had invited into my life were capable of treating an infant as a lever and a person as a line item. The rage that flooded me was not loud. It was a quiet arithmetic of betrayal. Your child will do anything for money when the idea of legacy becomes more important than the person who carried it. I left the house with the folder tucked under my coat and went straight back to Mrs. Chen's. She brewed tea and did not say, "I told you so." She only set the pot down, slid an extra blanket onto the bed, and said, "They always need someone who will notice the paper." Jake and I sat up late into the night with the folder spread like a map between us. He knew the town like a knuckle knows the rest of a hand. He had eyes for detail because fishermen learned to read weather in the twitch of a line and the smell of the wind. We read the emails, traced the invoices, matched handwriting. The more we read, the more the neat house of white cushions turned into a crime scene. We found a document that made my stomach drop. It wasn't a headline or an incriminating confession. It was a simple list of names tied to Whitmore Reproductive Services. There was an entry that linked Miranda Torres to the facility in a consulting capacity. Miranda, it turned out, had a pattern of operating between the gray lines of legality, offering expedited arrangements for clients who wanted discreet services, charging fees that would have made a bishop blush. The notes were not explicit about murder. They were explicit about acquisition, the careful creation of an heir through means that traded on the desperation of a young mother and the opacity of private medical clinics. I think the line that hurt the most, though, was a small typed sequence of steps labeled estate acceleration. It was a business plan. Step 1, create alternate heir via surrogacy. Step 2, transfer mother's custody to legal guardians with ties to the estate. Step 3, expedite death certificate or absence ruling. Step 4, move funds under temporary management. The phrase neutralize obstables, siktam, appeared next to a scribbled note that looked like Vanessa's handwriting. I called Danny Crawford before dawn. Danny is the sort of person who keeps his past in his shoulders and his instincts in his pockets. Ex-FBI, private investigator now by necessity and temperament, he answered on the third ring as if he had been expecting a call like mine for years. I told him the outline, my accidental fall, Jake's rescue, the obituary, the folder. He did not make a sound. That is the sound of someone doing the math in the dark. "You're alive," he said finally, which is not an observation but a strategy. The pause that followed was long enough to suggest he was collecting pieces on his end. "Stay somewhere safe. Do not contact David or Vanessa. I'll come in town tomorrow." Danny's arrival would become central later on. In that moment he was a button on a remote I could press when the world felt like it might lose focus. He asked the precise questions former agents asked. Who saw you? Who would benefit? What papers exist? He sounded bored, which in his business is often code for being efficiently motivated. There was more waiting for me than the folder. In the next drawer I found a thin, unmarked USB drive taped to the underside of a shelf. It felt like something out of a spy novel, except the stakes were not palace secrets, but a child's life and a woman's dignity. On it were dated emails, a scanned image of a notarized document with a notary seal that did not match any registry I could find, and a grainy photo of a basement, my son's house, where a crib was tucked into a damp corner. The baby in the picture had the same soft face as the photograph from Whitmore. The file names were chronological, carefully constructed breadcrumbing. I think, in the end, what steadied me was the ridiculousness of some things. Miranda Torres had left a voicemail on a now-deleted account, betraying a minute of complacency, where she thanked someone for making it clean. The phrase had no forensic value in law, perhaps, but its existence on a recording that some clerk had mishandled was an opening, a chink. People who behave as if they are invulnerable tend to drop the human moments that betray them. The deeper we dug, the more obvious the pattern became. A network of professionals, some greedy, some desperate, arranged a chain to manufacture a quiet heir and accelerate an estate. Whitmore handled births and surrogacies, a private courier handled certificates, Miranda and others handled legal front work. Sarah Collins's death hung over this machinery like a shadow. My mind reeled with possibilities that were not yet proof. By the time the sun rose strange and thick over Mrs. Chen's, my plan had been reshaped by fury into something colder and more useful. Survival first, then exposure. I would not be an embarrassment on a page. I would be someone who watched the ledger of their lives and slowly turned the page. Mrs. Chen offered more than porridge. She offered me contacts, an acquaintance who could make a phone appear untraceable for a short while, a gardener who liked to walk dogs and keep eyes. Jake offered his small skiff as a means to come and go without the community's watchful eyes. Tyler knocked at odd hours and brought me sandwiches. The human kind of love arrived in small packages. It did not look like money. It looked like bras thrown in a hamper and a woman who could drive you to a pharmacy at midnight. We began to speak in a language I'd never had to use before. Surveillance, chain of custody, witness placement. I had raised my son with an instinct to trust the world, unlearning that was like trying to read by a candle. But there is a kind of clarity in being betrayed. All the illusions burn away, and what remains are the facts. At night, I rehearsed conversations with David in my head. I had been his mother long enough to predict the curves of his defensiveness. "You don't remember," he would say, or "You're overreacting." He would rely on charm, on public sympathy, on the efficiency of money to soften questions. Vanessa, I imagined, would be more precise. No theatrics, only the narrow calculation of how to talk about an infant as a legacy. Here's what they didn't count on. I had always been good at paperwork. I had taught myself how to read margins and footnotes so I wouldn't be cheated. My life had been a series of small, deliberate steps, and after Robert's death, it had been those small habits that remained. They could move money, but they could not erase the trail paper leaves. On my third night in hiding, a letter slipped under Mrs. Chen's door. No handwriting, only a piece of paper folded like a professional apology. It was from Miranda Torres, short and cold. "We are sorry for your loss," it read, with the kind of corporate condolence that sounds like an invoice. The note was not intended to cool me, it was intended to test me. I folded it into my pocket as if it were a live coal. By then, the small town had already done the first part of their work. They had declared me dead on paper, and the world had begun to move the chess pieces. My son and daughter-in-law had been granted emergency access to part of the estate under the authority of temporary guardianship for the child. They had meant to consolidate power while the world mourned me. They had meant to move fast and loud enough that any protest would be drowned in public sympathy. But they had underestimated the stubbornness of things like paper and the inconvenient fact that a woman with a pen and a temper will not stop at outrage. We were not yet ready to make the phone call that would put a man like Danny in motion publicly. We were not yet ready to go to the media. We were cataloging. We were making lists of places to look, people to speak with, things to photograph. We were inventing time. I slept badly and woke better. The folder lay open on my lap like a secret I planned to read aloud to the people who would need to hear it. There was a photograph tucked into the corner. Sarah Collins, her hand on a stroller, her smile bright and unexamined. I folded the picture into my breast pocket like a vow. They had attempted to make me an inconvenience. They had pushed me into a sea that would have mulched me into a story with a beginning and no end. Instead, I had become inconvenient in a different way, alive, watchful, and quietly relentless. At dawn, with the morning gulls ragged against the wind, Jake tightened his grip on the wheel and said, "We start small. We find Carol." "Who is Carol?" I asked. "You'll see," Jake said, with that characteristic fisherman patience. "She's inside. She's close." And that, for now, is where the story took its next breath. A slow assembly of people who had nothing to gain from a fortune and everything to lose if they didn't stand up. It felt like reweaving a net with my own hands, knot by knot. The evidence in the Margaret Project had shown me the pattern. It had not yet shown me the whole face of those who pulled the strings. To do that, I would need someone like Danny, and someone who could move inside the house where a baby slept. We prepared our next steps with the kind of caution small towns teach you when they have fewer lawyers and more neighbors. We wrote names down in ink, not in memory. We planned meetings in the corners of public places. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I felt a small, wicked, and entirely practical excitement. That peculiar sensation of a long chess match opening into a board you can see clearly. As the sun climbed that day, Vanessa posted a photo of herself in a black dress. David's smile was slightly off. My obituary, I learned, had been picked up by a national outlet that liked scandal. The comments under the article were already forming. Petitions, hot takes, someone who wondered aloud about the ethics of surrogacy services. No one, I thought, as I watched the world spin on its axis of gossip, had yet asked the baby what he wanted. I closed the folder and tucked it back into my coat. The paper was heavy with everything it contained: evidence, cruelty, quiet mathematics. I went to the window of Mrs. Chen's room and looked out at the narrow street below. Life persisted in small details: a man watering pots, a child chasing a dog, the steady arc of a postal worker's stride. For every person who would treat a child like an asset, there were others who would wrap a blanket around an infant's head and sing to him for the sake of the sound. I had been taught to keep notes. I would teach them sometime soon that some notes are harder to erase. We found Carol because the kind of people who do this sort of thing always leave ordinary threads where someone kind is tangled. Jake's lead was a crossword of intuition: a nurse who tended to night shifts at a private home, who drove an old Camry and kept her hair in a tidy bun. We watched from a parked car 2 blocks away while she walked home from a late shift with a tote bag and a tired smile. Danny had the look of a man who sees usefulness the way others see scenery. He said nothing for a long minute, then nodded, the smallest sign that a bridge could be built. Carol answered our knock with the same wary kindness she offered her charges. She was younger than I expected, 40 maybe, her hands quick in the way of someone who had folded more than her share of hospital gowns. I did not waste time in pleasantries. I did what mothers do when they must recruit an ally. I told her the truth in tidy pieces and watched for the moment she ran the edges of it with her fingers. "I think someone made a baby into a business," I said. "I think the baby's birth mother, Sarah Collins, didn't get to keep breathing in the world because someone couldn't wait." I did not say more than that. The name Sarah was a lit candle between us. Carol's face changed the way good people's faces do when they are asked to see what they have been trying not to. Resolve replacing exhaustion. "I feed him at night," she said, quieter than the TV in the room, They told me he was their nephew. They paid me in cash sometimes. I thought. She stopped, the sentence unfinished and the admission loud in the air. That was the first confession that came with a diaper change. Carol agreed to be our inside voice. She would not bribe. She would risk her job. She gave us the kind of courage that comes from small mercies. She smuggled pieces of paper. She wrote names on napkins in ink that would not smear, she told us when people left a door unlocked. Mostly she listened while we plotted, and listening is a small, necessary violence against the kind of people who believe silence is their safety net. Danny set the frame. He organized what we could not have organized without someone who'd been inside that system. Chain of custody, how to secure a recording that could stand in court, how to show a photo is not a prop. He brought the language of law to our kitchen table so we could try things that would not ruin any case because we were in love with justice, not with theatrics. We worked in slow, careful fits. Carol would text us when the house was quiet. Jake would park his skiff a discreet distance away and take pictures through binoculars of comings and goings. Mrs. Chen made a spare room into a watch post and taught Tyler to wind a film camera like a priest preparing a rite. The boy was delighted to be useful and suspicious of adults who smiled too perfectly. Little things accumulated. A delivery receipt signed by Miranda Torres. A toll booth photo of Vanessa's car on the wrong side of town at a timestamp that contradicted their story. A bank transfer with a memo line that read expedite in a tone only accountants understand. Meanwhile, we fed the town just enough to keep the conspirators comfortable. Let them think I was gone. Let them rearrange the furniture of their new life with the smugness of people who believe public sentiment buys time. We flooded the small circles they moved in with plausible absence. We leaked a photograph of my funeral, a staged image of an empty pew, and let it travel. The effect was diabolically simple. It loosened their tongues and tightened their routines. People who think they've already won unbend into carelessness. There was one advantage I had that none of them accounted for. A lifetime of paying attention to the margins. I read the Margaret Project like a map to a burglar's house. I knew where to look for the small things that would embarrass a plane. Receipts with wrong fonts, initials that didn't match the hand in the will, notary stamps that did not correspond to any registry. Danny taught me to make sure those errors would be visible through the lens of an investigator. He said, "You find what they think nobody will check. I'll make sure the people who must check will check." One evening, Carol brought us what we had been praying for in more practical language, an invitation to meet Vanessa's nanny under the pretense of offering a used stroller. The nanny, Carol said her name slowly at first, as if tasting whether the syllables were safe, was the quiet sort, a woman who liked to be useful and invisible. She was a repository of small facts: what time dinners were served, who brought in packages, how the baby cried in the night. The nanny handed us a receipt that had been tucked into the bottom of a diaper bag, a courier receipt for a package sent from Whitmore Reproductive Services to a P.O. box registered under an alias. It was the kind of thing that made the ledger of their life that much harder to clean. Carol's role tightened the knot on our case. She began taking pictures of parenting logs, of a ledger where Vanessa had written vaccines and notes for custody hearing. She let us copy text messages, and sometimes she smuggled audio snippets that revealed the brittle edges of Vanessa's voice when she thought no one listened. These were not dramatic confessions. They were the pebbles that turned a pile into a cairn. Danny accelerated things. He arranged a recorded conversation, legal and admissible, where a third party, a woman posing as someone interested in expedited surrogacy, called Miranda Torres. We fed the call 3 simple, plausible lie threads and let Miranda walk into the trap. She did what professional manipulators do. She rationalized, she spoke in euphemism, she used terms like streamlining and client confidentiality, where others would use the word motive. The recording is the sort of thing that makes people uncomfortable because it reveals the ordinary language abetting extraordinary cruelty. Miranda's voice on that file was steady, calm, a precise salesperson explaining logistics. We also had the photographs from Jake that mattered. A blurred shot of someone carrying a baby into the basement on a rainy October night. A photo of Vanessa with an envelope that matched handwriting we'd found in the Margaret Project. A picture of a courier depositing a package at a mailbox registered to Whitmore. Every image was a statement if it could be placed in the context of evidence and properly narrated. Danny's office became our place of translation. He would take a raw picture and say, "Show this to the right person, under oath, and watch them stutter." He had the patience of a watchmaker and the appetite of a bulldog. But it was Miranda Torres who provided the crack we needed. There is a peculiar confidence that thrives in people who traffic in other people's secrets. Miranda believed her operation was clean because the business wore the color of legality. She hired notaries, she kept receipts, she had a Rolodex. She was a woman who spoke with the tone of someone who had never been questioned in public about her ethics. We called her the way I imagine one calls the bluff of a card shark, slow and steady, with enough menace to unsettle. I began to send notes. I called them taunts only in the sense that they were made to be seen and to prick. A folded photograph slipped into the mail with a single line. "You miscounted." Another card, typed, left on a park bench. "Do you sleep at night, Miranda?" Jake would later tell me he felt a childish delight in watching the underworld of expensive clothing twitch. I was careful. These notes were not threats. They were breadcrumbs placed to make people self-conscious and consequently careless. The goal was always to let the conspirators reveal themselves. They did. Vanessa started snapping pictures of strangers on the sidewalks near their lawyer's office and showing them to David, as if noting menace. He responded by installing an aftermarket security system the day after. The security company sent us, through a quiet ally at the firm, a monthly maintenance report that included timestamps of when the system had been disabled. That timeline lined up with a delivery of documents logged by a courier we had tracked. A curious intersection of cashier's checks and emergency notarizations. Then came the night Carol told us something that bristled against my bones. "He cries soft now," she said, referring to the baby. "But sometimes he stops, and it's like the house holds its breath." It was a small observation, domestic and human, and it made the gravity of what we were doing sharper. This child was not a statistic. He was somebody who was being handled like a chess piece. We had to make sure the law treated him as the person he was. The plan Danny devised for the confrontation was surgical in its simplicity. Assemble incontrovertible evidence in a place where Miranda, under an ostensible business pretext, would arrive to explain herself. Have the FBI ready to move on the proof. Let Miranda confess because that was the hinge point we required on record. He would coordinate with Agent Sarah Chan, who had been tracking Whitmore and had a curiosity that fit our findings. Danny's history with the Bureau meant he could listen to law enforcement's needs and shape our evidence to meet them. It was not our moment to play heroes. It was our moment to hand over a case and let professionals do what professionals do best. We selected the house, the old Harrison place, that had been repriced by a week of candlelit grief and well-tailored sobs. The plan called for me to be present in a way that would not jeopardize the operation. I would not burst through doors and shout accusations. I would let my presence be a pressure point. We would stage a reading of the trust under the pretense that the family wanted privacy. In truth, it was a mall, a place where confidentiality would make those who feared exposure complacent. On the day, I wore a dress that belonged to the period when Robert and I danced at silly office parties. It had pockets deep enough to hold the things mothers carry, a handkerchief, a pen, a tiny camera that looked like no camera anyone would notice. Jake parked 3 houses away, and positioned himself with binoculars. Mrs. Chen served tea to the delivery people who came and went, and later would swear she only did what good neighbors do. Carol had smuggled a small audio device in the baby's blanket when she brought it for a supposed feeding break that afternoon. Danny sat cramped in a waiting room with Agent Chan and her team, the kind of people who wear patience like body armor. They called the meeting at 2 p.m. David's voice was smooth, practiced. Vanessa's smile was precise. Miranda arrived late, as if being late conferred power. She wore a neutral suit, and her attention was the sort that could cleave a room. I sat in the corner with a teacup that trembled a little in my hand. My smile was a small thing. The more I had been cheated, the more I had learned the value of economy in my expressions. The conversation began with lawyers being lawyers, with phrasing designed to enclose threat in rhetoric. We left space for Miranda to speak. She did, and she did not realize that every mitigating clause she spoke would be recorded under a context that made her sound less like counsel and more like a handler of currency. At one point, she did what we had half hoped and half feared. She told us the mechanics of estate acceleration in the tone of someone explaining a scheduling problem. We ensure continuity for the child, she said, correcting the pronouns, smoothing the moral edges. We create an air situation that cannot be disputed. Miranda's voice was so untroubled it was almost comical. I felt a small, cold surge of satisfaction. She treated the life of a child like a schedule. Danny leaned forward and asked a question in an unremarkable voice. And what happens when unforeseen complications arise, like a death or a disappearance? Miranda's smile narrowed. We handle unexpected variables, she said. That's what contingency fees are for. Her phone buzzed on the table. She ignored it. That phone call was the hinge. The ringing phone was the ordinary noise of the modern tyranny. It pulled Miranda's attention away for a heartbeat. That breath was the gap in which someone like Miranda could betray herself. She resumed speaking more carelessly, rationalizing potentialities in language that made clear the architecture of the scheme. There were phrases: neutralize, expedite death certificate, temporary guardianship, that no competent lawyer would use in a board-level meeting unless she believed no one was listening. We had the recording, but we needed Miranda on tape to tie it to her voice and intent. Danny asked, as if thinking aloud, about Whitmore Reproductive Services and how their records were handled. Miranda's dismissal of any impropriety came out as a defense and as a confession. Processes, she said, had always been clouded and sometimes required disciplined handling. That was when I decided to speak. I rose slowly because speed would have made us ridiculous. I walked into the center of the parlor and sat in an armchair that had once been Robert's favorite. I let the room notice me. I did not shout. I did not fling documents across the floor. I unfolded the Margaret Project folder on the coffee table and opened it like a person does when she is showing a recipe to friends. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply read aloud a sequence of things that were not meant to be read: the courier receipts, the Whitmore invoices, the notation that Sarah Collins had died pending review. I read Vanessa's shorthand about accelerate probate and the list of names who had been paid. I watched the color leave faces in a way a paint expert watches a canvas reveal a change in texture, the subtle shift that tells you a picture is altered. Miranda, who had been so serene, began to speak like someone trying to correct a teacher. "Margaret, you misunderstand." "No," I said, and I was surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "You misunderstood mercy." I told them the little things that bent the room further. The receipt Carol had smuggled out, the maintenance report that showed the house, alarm turned off at untenable times, the birth certificate's P.O. box with a pen name. I watched Miranda's face turn from confident to taut, then to a kind of animal comprehension that comes when someone realizes a net is closing. That was when Agent Sarah Chan moved. FBI agents do not come in with Hollywood drama. They enter with documents and quiet authority. Agent Chan's team stepped into the hallway like a tide slipping into a trench. Danny had coordinated with them, and in the space of a heartbeat, they produced warrants, gloved hands, and the sort of precise choreography cultivated in training. Miranda, David, and Vanessa were read their rights. The suddenness of it made everything theatrical and mundane at once. Someone muttered about lawyers. Someone wept an ugly, quick weep of calculation. Miranda did not plead innocence in the way we expect in movies. She rationalized. This is the default posture of people who have convinced themselves they are administrators of reality rather than its violators. She spoke about client confidentiality and the murk of private practice. But we had stacked the room with facts that could not be obscured by rhetoric. Courier receipts, bank transfers, Whitmore records, Carol's logs, the Margaret Project folder, and Miranda's recorded calls where she used the language of expediency. The FBI seized computers, zipped boxes of paper, and carried them out like harvest. The baby, who had slept through much of the day like a small god who distrusts human timelines, was taken by a child services worker into protective custody, his cheeks still warm from the afternoon sun. He looked at me once, briefly, and I felt something like homeache open inside me. He did not know me. He only knew the sound of a woman's voice and a warmth in the room that was not financial. I had planned for the moment by making sure that the evidence would be overwhelming. Danny had made sure the recordings met admissibility requirements. Agent Chan had arranged for a team to secure the child and the house. The arrests were not a blow of personal revenge. They were a proper enforcement of the law. As they led Miranda away in handcuffs, she looked at me with a kind of mournful pride, as if she had been a surgeon who had never understood what it meant to kill a patient. "You should have been easier," she said. It was a sentence designed to wound the way only a woman who has counted on other people's soft spots can. "You would be easier if you were less certain that paper absolves you," I replied. My voice was still calm. I felt old and also fiercely new at the same time. The months that followed were slow in the manner that legal systems are slow. The FBI's raid produced pages and pages of documents. Whitmore's records, once subpoenaed, revealed invoices and appointments that matched the dates we had highlighted. Miranda's consultations were a web of expediency disguised as medical necessity. There were court filings and preliminary hearings, the kind of legal motion that sounds like a foreign language but holds the fate of children in legacies. David and Vanessa faced charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy to accelerate probate. Miranda faced a more tangled array of offenses, including charges related to the manipulation of medical records. The media circled in the new way they always do when scandal evolves into legal pursuit, with less certainty and more thirst. Some commentators wrote think pieces about the moral perils of privatized surrogacy. Others, meaner, asked why an elderly woman had been able to keep such a fortune. I did not read everything. I learned the hard wisdom of letting the lawyers read too much of it. My job, after the arrests, was quieter. It was paperwork and patience. One late afternoon, after a hearing where the judge had asked a question that humbled the room about how a child's welfare had been considered in the architecture of the plan, Carol came into my house with a thermos and an envelope. "For Robert," she said, "because names change everything." The envelope contained a preliminary ruling by a family court judge granting temporary custody to the state with instructions to find a fit and loving guardian and to prioritize the baby's stability. It was the kind of prose that feels cold but acts like glue. Legal language, yes, but at least not maleficent. I saw Robert, the baby who would eventually be called Robert Sarah by the docket, in a small window that month. He was wrapped in a blanket that smelled like starch and sadness, and he blinked with the bright blankness of infants who are not yet tasked with remembering betrayal. I held his small hand in mine for a minute that felt both sacramental and purely physical. There was a softness in me that had little to do with justice and everything to do with the human propensity to protect. The trial that followed was not a scene of cinematic revelations, with a single testimony turning everything on a dime. It was procedural, long, and tedious in parts, the sort of thing that often frustrates public appetite for closure. Witnesses were called, bank statements were exhibited. Forensic accountants drew lines like constellations. Carol testified with a quiet steadiness that made the judge nod the way people nod at truth. Jake testified about the rescue. Danny described the chain of evidence. Agent Chan outlined the Bureau's findings about the network. Miranda testified with a practiced poise that attempted to redirect culpability into the shadows of systemic demand and client confidentiality. David and Vanessa had lawyers who painted them as naive actors in a script someone else had written. But the paper trail doesn't much admire good storytelling when the ink has been abused to fabricate legal fiction. The jury took its time, and when it came back, it did what juries sometimes do in slow, deliberate ways. It held people to the standard of law. Those found culpable received sentences that matched the gravity of their actions. Miranda was convicted on counts tied to fraud and tampering with medical documents. David and Vanessa were convicted on charges that reflected their part in the scheme. The court sentenced them to terms that separated them from the world they had intended to control. I will not revel in the details of how long or where. The important fact is that the legal system in this instance did what it was designed to. It used evidence to find a verdict. The investigation into Sarah Collins's death continued. It was treated with the caution her case deserved. Her name, which had once been a thin entry in a folder, became the centerpiece of a homicide inquiry that sought to honor what we could no longer retrieve. I attended hearings about her death like someone who had been present at a prayer, quiet, raw, determined that the story of a young mother would not be flattened into a footnote. We never allowed the news cycle to turn her into an idea. She remained in our work a person who had been wronged. After the trials, after the boxes of paper had been catalogued and filed, there was a quieter legal conversation. Adoption. With Miranda and others out of the picture, with David and Vanessa removed from custody, the state indicated it would look for a stable guardian for Robert. The idea of me adopting felt at first like an audacity. I was an old woman with a history and some scars. But the child needed a home that knew how to keep a routine and give love without ledger. The judge saw what Carol and Danny and Agent Chan had seen, a woman who had lost much and had the kind of stubborn, steady patience that children need. Adoption is a legal and emotional apparatus that resisted grand gestures. It came through forms, through references from Mrs. Chen and Jake, through background checks and home studies. I went through it because the alternative, watching the child pass through systems and foster care with the probability of more displacement, felt intolerable. The court, with the tenderness of a system that occasionally gets things right, granted me custody. In a small hearing room, under the watchful eyes of professionals who had once considered me a statistic, I promised to keep a child who had known only being used from now on, being loved. We named him Robert Sarah Harrison because names remember people. It felt like the right stitch, my husband's name to acknowledge the life Robert had built, Sarah's name to honor the mother who had been taken from this story under suspicious circumstances. The combination felt like an apology I could make in ink and action. Life after the verdicts was a slow, cautious reweaving. I learned to change diapers with an efficiency that would make a hospital nurse nod approvingly. I learned that lullabies are the first currency of trust. Mrs. Chen came every week with soup and advice. Jake turned his weathered skiff into a Sunday routine of small excursions where Robert would stare at gulls and squint against salt. Tyler became an honorary uncle who understood the bright responsibility of being kind with toys. Carol, who had been the first to risk a conscience in Vanessa's house, became the child's nurse of choice, a quiet angel who insisted on keeping him in the cleanest possible routines. I do not pretend that the recovery was without shadows. There were nights when I woke with the sound of waves and the smell of diesel in my mouth, when I found my hands clawing at blankets as if I had learned to swim in the wrong places. There were mornings when the proof of a life left in bank statements and legal schedules weighed heavier than any physical ache. But there were also moments of astonishing smallness. The way Robert's fist unconsciously curled around my finger, the ridiculous way he laughed at a dog he had never met, the plastic ring that delighted him for an hour and then lost interest. One of the hardest parts of being alive after a plot to make you dead is the public appetite for a tidy movie ending. People want a single sentence to summarize pain and justice. Life rarely gives clean sentences. The network that had profited from Whitmore and Miranda did not vanish overnight. There were appeals and motions and a mess of professional reputations to go around. But the backbone of our work, the folder, the recordings, the testimony, stood up in court and helped do its job. In the months that followed, I found myself repeating a small truth to anyone who would listen. Money magnifies character. It does not create it. Someone with kindness cannot buy cruelty into decency. Someone with greed will always try to paper over their conscience. This was not a revelation. It was the kind of arithmetic you learn when you read ledgers in the dark. I also learned the sweetness and bizarre dignity of chosen family. Family had always been a word I used with the assumption that it mapped to bloodline and obligation. I learned to treat it as a verb, something you enact, not just inherit. Jake, Mrs. Chen, Danny, Carol, Agent Chan, Tyler. They were not relatives by DNA. They were relatives by choice, by the work of staying. We had been stitched together by a small, determined faith in one another. There is a strange irony in how quiet the domestic moments are after a public drama. We installed curtains that closed the street off like a memory. We repainted Robert's room in a color that makes his eyes glow. I taught him about the sea, how it is both generous and indifferent, and I taught him how to tie a shoe. I told him about Robert, the man my husband had been, in the way one tells a legend to a child, with humility and room for questions. Sometimes people ask what I would do differently. I do not imagine the yacht day at all anymore. When the sea comes to mind, it is step by step, a cane sliding, a splash, Jake's hand. The rest is evidence and effort. I do not waste energy on fantasies of revenge. I have a life to keep and a child who will learn manners from me whether I deserve it or not. Legal battles leave scars in the real world as much as in paper. Whitmore was fined and re-evaluated under new scrutiny. Laws quietly changed in our small patch of the map. Stricter oversight for certain private clinics, a tightening of documentation requirements for surrogacy arrangements. People who had been too ready to see a child as an asset began to find the contours of their own conscience under a brighter light. This is not to say the world became morally pristine overnight. I do not believe in fairy tales. But the arc of justice is sometimes a function of persistence and the dull, unglamorous work of people who will not let a ledger outgrow its obligations to humanity. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that surviving is not the same as triumph. Surviving is the first requirement. Triumph is what you make afterward. How you put the pieces back into a pattern that honors people rather than portfolios. I have a child who will know his mother's name because we taught him to remember, and I have a community who will not let such a plan go unremarked again. The strangest compliment, if such a thing can exist, came from an unlikely place. At the end of one hearing, A woman who had been a neighbor of Vanessa's came up to me in the hallway. She hesitated, then held my hand like one human to another. "You were always so fierce with your ledger," she said. "I thought it was vanity. Turns out it was self-defense." She laughed, not cruelly, but with the understanding that many women of my age have learned the subtler arts of self-preservation. When people ask how it feels to watch your son led away in handcuffs, the honest answer is complicated. There is grief, and there is a kind of stupid clarity. Sometimes love is not enough to excuse atrocity. You do not stop being a mother because you hold others accountable. Love and accountability are not opposites. They are, in the best cases, partners. I still make lists. I stack receipts with the same slow precision that saved me in the beginning. Some habits are useful. Some are armor. I teach Robert, in small ways, how to keep his things neat, how to make a list and then check it. He will be a different kind of man because he has already seen both the worst and the best people can do. Now, when I walk along the marina with Jake and Tyler at my side, people sometimes recognize me and ask a question. "Were you really pushed from a yacht?" I nod and let the story be what it is, a truth complicated by evidence and pain. They lean in for the shock and stay for the lesson. Money multiplies opportunity, but it does not manufacture morality. If you've made it this far, I'll leave you with something modest and practical. Keep notes. Read the margins. Ask questions when someone offers convenience at the speed of grief. And when the world tries to tell you to accept a neat explanation for a life, do what I did. Do not accept convenience when the cost is a human life. Before I go, if this story landed with you in some unexpected way, do me a favor. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear that being alive is a power. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These small human connections are the stitches that keep us from being unstitched. And if you've ever been betrayed by someone you loved, tell the story. There is strength in telling truth aloud. They pushed me off a yacht. They thought $3 billion would buy them the final page. What happened next was not a miracle so much as a meticulous refusal to disappear. I was rescued by a fisherman, sheltered by a woman with good soup, and supported by people who chose to be family. In the end, the child at the center of their plan has a home that will teach him first to be human, and then, perhaps, to be just. That, to me, is the most shocking outcome of all.